Thank you for joining us. Excited to have you all here. Hope everyone's day has started well and you're excited for what's to come. Now, I am, perhaps rather ambitiously, going to try and summarize this entire industry in the next 15 minutes. And so the idea is to offer a bit of a foundational overture to some of the major themes we've seen evolve, not only throughout 2018, but certainly since October the 17th in particular. And no better place to start than, obviously, in Canada, and focusing on the adult use market in particular. So when we think about the number of stories and narratives that really bubbled up through the year, there are a number that would compete for the #1 spot. Of course, if you think just about the capital market space, we had a flurry of activity. Cronos, for example, attaining the first US listing by a Canadian LP. We had Tilray with one of the most remarkable IPOs of all time, a $5 billion investment into Canopy by Constellation, and of course Aurora acquiring a number of assets, not least what would have been one of their largest competitors, MedReleaf. But really, and that's just in the capital market space, but really none of those can compete with the one highlight of the entire year, and that is obviously the fact that we are now in a place where 95.5 years later, we live in a post-prohibition era. We did it. And when I say we, I do mean the collective we. I mean to say that everyone in this room played some small role, but I think it's an important pause to take and recognize the work of the advocates and activists who have dedicated their lives for years, and in some cases decades, to get us to where we are today. Without their commitment, without their passion for the cause, we wouldn't be in this room, and so we have them really to thank more than anyone else. It's thanks to them that we get to stand here today and say that cannabis is legal again. What a wonderful series of words, and hopefully we can actually utter those words in any country all around the world and find them to be true. Having said that, we have seen a number of key market themes emerge since October 17th. I'm going to fly through a few of them here. The first is that retail has really resembled a bit of a choke point for distribution and access. We obviously have no stores in Ontario yet, 12 in Quebec open today, and 5 in BC, which means a great deal of our population is still accessing cannabis through online only. When we look at this scenario and assess its dynamics, we think of 4 notable problems. The first is that it's very difficult to replicate the online very difficult to replicate the in-store shopping experience online by virtue of not having a store staff member to go up to and ask questions, particularly because we know the consumer base is relatively naive. We also know that cannabis is a tactile shopping experience, especially in the US. We've seen how customers like to see and smell the bud that they're purchasing. That obviously can't be done in an online fashion. We know from beverage alcohol sales that a great deal of those purchases are made in the hours of 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays as well, which we can assume would be for short-term or same-day consumption. Again, only the convenience of brick and mortar really satisfies that particular need. And then lastly, channel preference. It has been a struggle for some beverage alcohol players to actually break into the online space. By way of example, the LCBO launched their online sales portal a few years ago, and last year still only 0.07% of all their sales went through their online store. We have had a well-documented supply shortage. We at Lift & Co. think that though this obviously is a key narrative, it has been somewhat over-denounced, I'll say, and that's partly because the alternative, obviously, is to wait until the supply-demand equilibrium would be even, and that would mean that we'd have LPs sitting on a number of their products and stockpiling supply for months and maybe even years. That said, of course, we are still in a place where right now we have a huge shortage. But we think that the confidence in the position many of the LPs take today, where every single gram that is sold, is grown, is sold, will slowly shift into a concern and an eye to the price compression and therefore margin compression that we'll see down the line. These are our estimated projections for the market. If you look at states like Oregon, for instance, they have had such a flood of licensing that in the last 12 months, the wholesale price of cannabis has dropped by 65%. And the last theme in the adult use market is low brand awareness. So we recognize that given the restriction around marketing, there is a low level of awareness of the brands in the industry. Ipsos conducted a survey recently and asked consumers, How many brands can they identify? 64% actually named a strain, that is a street name for a particular cultivar, rather than a corporate brand or a consumer brand. So we know that this is because they're being introduced to a plethora of new names and terms. And where we believe the market is resembled by this visual on the left-hand side, a relatively small playground with tight rules, fairly monochromatic, we're hopeful that over time we will see something like this on the right emerge, where brands can actually better position themselves, carve out their niches, and better speak to consumers like the individuals that they are, rather than part of a larger group. It's not only better for business, it's a more favorable consumer experience. On the medical side, we've seen a number of interesting dynamics emerge, not only over the past few years, but certainly as a result of adult use. This is the historical growth of patient registrations in this country since the MMPR, or at least the early stages of that. You see that it's been quite a fast trajectory. Interestingly, in the last quarter's worth of data, that's for period ending September 30th, we actually saw a slowdown in patient registrations. In that 3-month period, there were just over 11,000 new patient registrations. That compares to a monthly average of just under 11,000 for the previous 12 months. Does that foreshadow a decline in patient registrations, as we saw in many US states? Again, I'll pick on Oregon, but their active patient registration count has actually halved since the implementation of that state's adult use program. Anecdotally, we know that a lot of LPs are informally or in some cases formally reporting that patient registrations have actually increased, though, since October 17th. And so the next quarter's data will confirm or validate those theories. And lastly, when we look at that same data published by Health Canada, we see that once again, there has been a steady increase in medical sales. This is by tonnage. But in the last quarter, we saw an overall 8% decline in tonnage. This is dried cannabis as well as the equivalized tonnage for oils. And this is partly because the product mix shifted from dried cannabis to oils, and we're hearing from patients that that's because they believe, at least ostensibly, that there is better dosing and so or more standardized dosing, and so those products actually last longer. But also we recognize that some LPs were stockpiling their product in anticipation of adult use opening up. All to say, we have seen progress on the medical side, but it is slow. And so we want to ensure that despite all the focus on the adult use market, we're not deprioritizing patients and their needs. Those, in our minds, should come first. So we have a few key themes that we want to see addressed. The first is an absence of information. Without, of course, the progression through the regular drug approval pathway, these products don't have DINs, therefore they don't have health indications. So patients are left either to self-research, self-medicate, and in some cases engage in trial and error, which obviously is not an ideal healthcare experience. We also know affordability remains an issue. CFAM conducted a study and found that 60% of medical patients cannot afford their daily prescription. We don't have broad insurance coverage, and this is something we'd like to see addressed this year too. We also have a dearth of cannabis-positive physicians. Today, fewer than 1 in 5 physicians in this country are actively prescribing medical cannabis. So there's a huge opportunity there for more HCP education and hopefully adoption of cannabis and acceptance of cannabis into a regular treatment program. And then the lack of selection, partially because we've seen product allocated to the adult use channels, but we've heard from patients that they have been struggling to access their medicine. Again, something we'd like to see prioritized by the market at large. Take a quick spin around the world because, of course, we would be remiss not to mention some of the other interesting dynamics elsewhere. Today, this is how we see the world. I'll caveat this chart or this map by emphasizing that every time you ask anyone to fill this in, you will have, it looks slightly different by virtue of how they categorize decriminalization or legalization. But at any rate, this is how we see the world today. A few markets that are interesting to us. The UK, of course, is a particular focus. The UK sprinted through a medical review after the ACMD, their advisory council on misuse of drugs, responded to what can only be described as a public outcry at the confiscation of a little boy's medicine, an 11-year-old's medicine, on his way back from Canada, actually. That market launched on November the 1st, and though it is fairly restrictive, it is a major milestone. Of course, Germany launched their market on March 10th of 2017. Their patient count stands at in excess of 40,000. There's a very robust system of socialized healthcare, which means that roughly 2/3 of patients have their medicine entirely covered by the state. LPs selling into this market also can charge a premium price. So for example, 2 quarters ago, we saw that Canopy Growth reported a 60% incremental price for grams sold into Germany in comparison to grams sold to Canadian patients. And then lastly, and perhaps just interestingly, South Korea has also legalized medical cannabis, albeit for pharmaceutical products only. We saw a bill make its way slowly through the parliamentary process until a catalyst occurred in August. That's when the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety reported they were going to endorse the bill. And all of a sudden, and again, although it's only for pharmaceutical cannabis, we have a major East Asian market who are opening up. And insofar as they're seen as a leader in the APAC region, we think this could be a catalyst for other countries in that market or in that region to come online too. So this is the state of the world today. Somewhat speculative on our part, but we like to look forward and looking 2 years out. This is what the world may look like. Notice how the map fills in quite a bit. Markets that we're watching are, one, Mexico. Mexico had an election in the summer, and the new president, President Obrador, has been very vocal about legalizing adult use cannabis. That piece of legislation was tabled 2 months ago and would theoretically open up the largest adult use market in the entire world, given Mexico's population of 135 million. France ran through a medical review as well. They are the largest European country to have not legalized medical access. And the ANSM, their National Agency for Medical and Product Safety, has recommended that that system is implemented by the end of 2019. If things move fast, then that actually may happen. And then lastly, there is a new coalition government in Luxembourg who have promised that they will be legalizing adult use within the next 5 years, making it theoretically the first European country to do so. Now, of course, we would be remiss not to mention the United States. Several interesting dynamics happening there. The first thing, of course, is to recognize that the United States represents a shifting political landscape. Currently, we have 33 states plus the District of Columbia who have medical access. Almost 70% of the American population lives in those states. Now, we also have over a quarter of Americans who live in a state with legal adult use access. This is becoming a bipartisan issue. We know that the majority of Americans, and now even as of about a year ago, the majority of registered Republicans are in support of full adult use access. On June the 25th, the FDA approved Epidiolex, recognizing the therapeutic potential of CBD. And we think this, in conjunction with the Farm Bill, really will spawn a CBD-specific market. CBD, in our mind, will split off and become its own market, distinct from regular cannabis, and certainly growing at double or probably triple-digit growth for the next few years. The Farm Bill, by way of fact, legalizes hemp at the federal level, as well as all hemp-derived CBD, which would make the US a major player in that market, especially if the UN decides to remove CBD from its international drug treaties, perhaps later this year. And lastly, we have the States Act, a piece of legislation that would protect state legal markets from the risk of federal prosecution and would de-risk all of those multi-state or single-state operators in the US who technically today are still breaking federal law by virtue of the fact that cannabis remains Schedule I. So I will close with just a note on Canada, and I'll come back to us, because although October 17th represented a very exciting market launch for us, it actually was just the first. We have a second market launching later this year, and of course I'm talking about the introduction of edibles, extracts, and topicals. Our position is that this will redefine the face of cannabis in a very large fashion. By virtue of the fact that the products are higher margin, they're more easily branded, they are, to many people, more favorable because they are free of combustion. So to us, we see them as category creative, especially because they appeal to lifestyle, and they will represent a slew of new usage occasions, both for current and new consumers. We see from the US that that is the trajectory of the shift in consumer preference trends. Dried flower now represents less than 50% of all sales in mature US states. That's to say Colorado, Oregon, Washington, and indeed California, despite that market only being just a year old. For new consumers who are thinking about how to enter the category and maybe be intimidated by the idea of a joint or smoking anything really, we know that edibles are a point of preference for them. So again, this for us is an opportunity to redefine the face of the category and welcome new consumers in. All to say, and I'm sure this room is already aware, the draft regulations have already been published by Health Canada, and I want to pause here and underscore that it is unto us to give the regulator our feedback. Whether you agree, disagree, feel particular passion for a particular point, this is part of the participatory process the government has set up, and without voicing our opinions, our concerns, or our support, then we really forfeit the right to complain down the line. So a gentle reminder that our feedback as an industry, whether that's you reporting as an individual or on behalf of a corporation, is due February the 20th. Please do so. This is part of building the industry together. That brings me to the end of this 15-minute sprint. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your business conference day.